Daniel Carter had exactly 90 seconds to clean out a desk that had held 11 years of his life, and nobody in that glass tower even looked up as he did it. If a story like this has ever made your chest tighten and your eyes sting, stay until the very end, because what happens to this quiet, broken man will remind you why kindness is never wasted. And if it moves you, hit like and subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be heard by more people who still believe in second chances. The morning it happened, Daniel had woken up at 5, the way he always did, to make sure his daughter's lunch was packed before she woke for school. Lily was 8 years old, all gap-toothed smiles and stubborn cowlicks, and she was the only reason Daniel Carter still remembered how to laugh. Her mother had died 3 years earlier, a sudden illness that stole a wife and left a widower who had to learn, almost overnight, how to braid hair, how to explain nightmares, how to hold a small, trembling body at 2 in the morning and promise her that everything would be okay, even when he wasn't sure it would be. He worked as a senior systems engineer at Voss Dynamics, one of the largest logistics and technology conglomerates in the country, a company whose servers moved freight, medicine, and food across half a continent every single day. Daniel had built pieces of that infrastructure with his own hands, had spent sleepless nights patching vulnerabilities nobody else even knew existed, had quietly kept the company's oldest and most fragile systems breathing long after newer engineers said they should be scrapped. He never asked for credit. He never asked for a raise he technically deserved. He simply showed up every day and did the work that made everything else possible. That morning, a memo arrived instead of a paycheck. Cost restructuring, it said. Redundancy in legacy systems personnel, it said. Effective immediately, it said. Daniel read the words 3 times before they made any sense, and even then they didn't feel real. 11 years reduced to 2 paragraphs of corporate language and a security escort waiting by the elevator. He wanted to ask why. He wanted to demand an explanation from someone, anyone, who could look him in the eye. But the man from Human Resources wouldn't meet his gaze, and the directive, he was told, had come from the very top, from Eleanor Voss herself, the billionaire CEO who had inherited her father's empire and was determined to prove, in her first year at the helm, that she could cut costs faster and harder than anyone expected. It ordered an aggressive restructuring across every department that didn't generate on a spreadsheet somewhere, in a boardroom Daniel had never once entered. His entire career had been reduced to a single line item, and that line item had been marked for elimination. He carried a small cardboard box out of that building in front of colleagues, who suddenly found their computer screens fascinating, and nobody said goodbye. Nobody said thank you. 11 years, and the elevator doors closed on his reflection like the building itself was ashamed to keep watching. He sat in his car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before he could make himself turn the key. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He thought about his mortgage. He thought about Lily's school fees, her ballet lessons, the winter coat she was going to need in a few months because she'd grown 3 inches since spring. He thought about the promise he had made at his wife's graveside, whispered so quietly that only the wind could have heard it, that he would never let their daughter feel unsafe, that he would build a life sturdy enough to hold her no matter what the world took from him. And on that ordinary Tuesday morning, the world had taken his job, and with it, it felt like it had taken the floor out from under that promise. He didn't tell Lily that night. He picked her up from school with the same smile he always wore, listened to her recount, in exhausting 8-year-old detail, the entire plot of a cartoon she'd watched at a friend's house, and made her favorite dinner, macaroni with the crispy edges she loved. He tucked her in, read 2 chapters of a book about a brave little fox, and only after her breathing had gone slow, and even did he sit down at the kitchen table with a stack of bills and let himself finally break. The weeks that followed were brutal in a way that no resume could ever capture. Daniel applied to 23 companies in the first 10 days. He heard back from 4. 2 rejections came within hours, generic and cold. The kind of instant no that told him a machine had scanned his resume and decided he wasn't worth a human's time. He was 38, not old by any reasonable measure, but old enough, apparently, in an industry obsessed with chasing the newest graduates for half the salary. He started selling things, first the things that didn't matter, an old guitar he never played, a watch his father had given him. Then the things that did matter, a little more. He told Lily they were decluttering, and she believed him because she was 8, and because he was very good at making frightening things sound like adventures. There was a night about 10 days into his unemployment when Lily found him at the kitchen table surrounded by bills he'd tried to hide from her. She was supposed to be asleep, but she'd come downstairs for water and stopped in the doorway, watching her father rub his eyes in a way she'd only ever seen him do at her mother's funeral. "Daddy, are you sad?" she asked, in that small, direct way children have of cutting straight through every carefully constructed adult pretense. Daniel almost lied. He almost told her he was fine, that grown-up paperwork was just boring, that she should go back to bed. Instead, for reasons he couldn't fully explain even to himself, he pulled out the chair beside him and told her the truth. In words small enough for an 8-year-old to hold. He told her that sometimes even grown-ups lose their jobs, that it wasn't because he'd done anything wrong, and that they might have to be careful with money for a little while. She listened with the grave seriousness only children can manage. And then she went to her room and came back with the ceramic piggy bank she'd been filling with birthday money and lost teeth allowance for 2 years, and set it on the table in front of him. "You can have this," she said, "so you don't have to be sad anymore." Daniel had survived losing his job, survived the silence in that glass elevator, survived nights of math that never balanced, but it was his daughter's piggy bank, offered without hesitation, that finally broke him completely, and he cried in front of her for the first time since her mother's funeral, not from despair this time, but from a love so fierce it felt like it might crack his ribs open. He didn't take her money, of course. He hugged her until she squirmed to be let go, and he made a private promise that night that whatever else happened, whatever pride he had to swallow, whatever doors he had to knock on, he would make sure she never again felt like she had to offer up her piggy bank to save her father. He doubled down on his search the next morning with a different kind of determination, not the desperate scattershot applying of his first week, but something steadier, something that refused to let one company's cruelty define the rest of his story. Still, the weeks were hard in ways that tested him daily. He picked up freelance contract work where he could find it, patching small business websites and untangling other people's broken code for a fraction of what he was worth, just to keep the lights on. He learned to say no to Lily's requests for things that used to be easy yeses, a movie night, a new pair of sneakers, and he hated every single one of those small refusals more than he'd ever hated anything at his old job. He started walking her to school instead of driving, telling her it was good exercise, when really it was one more way to save on gas he could no longer casually spend. She never complained. If anything, she seemed to walk a little taller beside him, chattering about clouds shaped like dinosaurs, utterly unaware that her father was quietly rebuilding the ground beneath both their feet, one small sacrifice at a time. 3 weeks after he was fired, disaster struck the very company that had discarded him. It began quietly, the way real disasters always do. A routine software update pushed through VOS Dynamics' outdated freight routing infrastructure, the exact legacy systems Daniel had spent a decade quietly protecting. Except now, the man who understood those systems better than anyone alive was gone, and the new update collided catastrophically with code so old and so specific that only its original architect could safely untangle it. Within 6 hours, half the company's national logistics network had frozen. Medical shipments sat undelivered in warehouses. Perishable food rotted on stalled trucks. Contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars hung by a single corrupted server cluster, and every engineer VOS Dynamics currently employed stared at code they had never been taught to read, because nobody had ever bothered to properly document what Daniel Carter carried entirely in his own head. Eleanor Voss stood in the command center at 2 in the morning, watching red failure alerts multiply across a wall of screens like a spreading infection. And for the first time since she'd taken over her father's company, she understood real fear. She had built her entire first year around a simple, ruthless philosophy: trim the fat, modernize fast, prove to the board and to her father's old guard that she wasn't just an heiress playing dress-up in a corner office. She had approved the restructuring memo herself, glancing at names and titles and severance costs, without ever once wondering what any of those names meant to the systems still quietly running beneath her company's feet. Now those systems were failing, live, publicly, catastrophically, and not one person in that command center could explain why or how to stop it. It was her chief technology officer, ashen-faced and exhausted, who finally said the name out loud. Daniel Carter, the senior engineer they'd let go 3 weeks earlier, the one man who had personally written and maintained the exact subsystem now collapsing. Eleanor stared at him for a long moment, the weight of what she'd done pressing down on her chest like something physical. She had fired the one person capable of preventing this. She had looked at a cost report instead of a person, and now that decision was threatening to cost the company everything. She found his number buried in an old HR file and called him herself at 3 a.m, her voice tighter and more uncertain than it had been in years. Daniel let it ring twice before he answered, half asleep, Lily's night light glowing faintly down the hallway. When Eleanor Voss identified herself, something cold and hard settled in his chest. Of course she was calling, not to apologize, not to ask how he and his daughter were surviving, only because something had broken that only he could fix. He almost said no. God, some small, wounded part of him wanted to say no more than he had ever wanted anything, wanted to feel, just once, what it was like to make the people who discarded him beg. But then he thought about the truck drivers who wouldn't get paid if those systems stayed down. He thought about the warehouse workers, people just like him, people with kids and rent and worry whose jobs depended on freight that couldn't move. He thought, absurdly, of a hospital somewhere waiting on a shipment of medicine that was rotting on a frozen truck because of code only he understood. His anger was real, but so was his conscience, and in the end, his conscience was louder. "I'll come," he told her, "but I want to be clear about something. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this because good people are going to get hurt if I don't." Eleanor was quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment. "That's fair," she finally said, and something in her voice cracked just slightly, just enough for Daniel to hear it. "That's more than fair." He drove to the office at 4 a.m, Lily asleep in the back seat wrapped in a blanket because there was no one else to watch her, and something about the sight of that little girl curled up in his rearview mirror, dragged out of bed because the world couldn't wait, made Eleanor Voss's throat tighten when she saw them walk through the doors of the command center. A father who should have been protected by the company he'd built, cradling his sleeping child because that same company had left him with no safety net and no choice. Daniel didn't waste time on speeches. He sat down at a terminal, cracked his knuckles once out of old habit, and began working through code that read like a foreign language to everyone else in that room, but felt, to him, like coming home. Hours passed. Coffee went cold. Eleanor watched him work with a kind of stunned, humbled silence, watched engineers twice his salary defer to him without hesitation, watched him patiently explain, without a trace of bitterness, exactly why the system had failed and exactly how to fix it, knowledge he could have kept to himself out of spite, and didn't. By 7 a.m, the failure alerts on the wall of screens began, one by one, to turn from red to green. Trucks began moving again. Warehouses came back online. The medical shipment that had haunted Daniel's thoughts all night finally cleared its final routing checkpoint and rolled out toward the hospital that needed it. A collective, exhausted breath went through the command center, the kind of relief that only comes after staring disaster directly in the face and somehow, miraculously, winning. Eleanor Voss walked over to where Daniel sat, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion, his daughter now awake and quietly coloring in a notebook beside him, and she did something she had not done publicly in longer than she could remember. She apologized, not the careful, lawyer-approved kind of apology companies issue in press releases, but a real one, raw and unguarded, delivered in front of her own senior staff. She told him that firing him had been the single worst decision of her career. Not because of what it had cost the company, but because of what it revealed about the kind of leader she had allowed herself to become. Someone who read spreadsheets instead of understanding the people behind them. I looked at a number, she told him, her voice unsteady, and I let that number tell me you didn't matter. I was wrong. You were never a redundancy. You were the reason this company could function at all, and I didn't have the humility to see it until it was almost too late. Daniel didn't respond right away. 3 weeks of fear, of selling things that mattered, of lying awake doing math that never worked out, of watching his daughter ask innocent questions he didn't know how to answer. All of it sat heavy in his chest. He had every right to walk away. But he looked over at Lily, quietly colouring beside him, safe and warm, and unaware of how close her whole world had come to collapsing, and he thought about what kind of example he wanted to set for her. Not bitterness, not revenge. Something better than that. I appreciate you saying that, he finally said. But an apology doesn't fix 3 weeks of missed mortgage payments, or the fact that your company let a father with an 8-year-old daughter walk out with a cardboard box and no warning. If you really mean what you're saying, show me, not with words, with how you treat the next person whose name shows up as a line item on a spreadsheet. Eleanor didn't flinch from that. She nodded slowly, absorbing it, and then she did something no one in that command center expected. She didn't simply offer him his old job back. She created an entirely new position, Director of Critical Systems and Infrastructure, with a seat at the leadership table, full authority over how legacy systems were documented, staffed, and protected going forward, and a salary that finally reflected what his expertise had always been worth. She personally covered the wages lost during his 3 weeks of unemployment, not as charity, but as an acknowledgement of a debt that was hers to repay. And she asked him directly and sincerely to help her rebuild the company's culture so that no other employee, no matter their title or their salary, would ever again be reduced to a line on a cost-cutting spreadsheet. It took Daniel a few days to decide. He thought about pride, and he thought about practicality. And mostly, he thought about Lily, about the kind of stability she deserved, and the kind of father he wanted to be. Not one who let anger cost his daughter a secure future, but not one who let himself be walked over either. In the end, he accepted on his own terms, with conditions Eleanor agreed to without hesitation, because for the first time she understood exactly what she was agreeing to protect. Word of what happened spread quietly through Voss Dynamics, then less quietly until it became something like company folklore, the single dad who got fired for a number on a spreadsheet, and ended up saving the entire company, and in doing so, changed how it treated every single person who worked there. Eleanor Voss instituted new policies within the month. No restructuring decision could be finalized without a human review of every position's actual function. No termination could happen without direct consultation with the department it affected, and every employee, regardless of rank, was guaranteed a real conversation before any decision that would upend their life. It wasn't perfect, no company ever is, but it was real change, born out of a mistake that had nearly cost lives and had cost one good man 3 of the hardest weeks of his life. Daniel still worked long hours, some nights later than he would have liked, but never again without knowing with absolute certainty that his work and his worth were seen. He watched his daughter's ballet recitals from the front row now, without checking his phone for job alerts between routines. He replaced the guitar he'd sold, though he still hadn't found time to relearn it. Some evenings, exhausted from work, he'd sit on the porch and think about that terrible morning with the cardboard box. And instead of bitterness, he mostly just felt a strange, quiet gratitude. Not for the pain, never for the pain, but for what it had taught him about his own strength, and about the fact that sometimes the very worst days of your life are simply the universe clearing space for something you never expected to receive. Eleanor Voss changed too, in ways that went beyond policy memos and press releases. She started walking the floors of her own company, actually talking to the people who kept it running, learning their names, their stories, the small, unglamorous work that never showed up on a balance sheet, but without which nothing else was possible. She kept a single framed photograph on her desk after that, Not of a stock chart, not of a milestone, but of the moment the command center screens turned from red to green, a quiet reminder that behind every system, every number, every line item, there was always a human being who deserved to be seen. And Daniel, tucking his daughter in each night in a home that was finally, fully secure again, understood something he tried gently to pass on to her, something he hoped she'd carry long after she'd forgotten the details of this hard chapter in their lives. That being underestimated is not the same as being worthless, that the people who overlook you are not the ones who get to decide your value, and that sometimes the very people who fail you the hardest are the ones who end up learning, because of you, exactly what it means to do better. It wasn't the story he would have chosen for them, but it was the story that made them both, in the end, stronger, kinder, and finally, unshakably certain of exactly what and who truly mattered. Months later, on a Tuesday that felt, in every ordinary way, like the Tuesday that had once broken him, Daniel stood in the back of Lily's school auditorium, watching her take a bow after her class play, her whole face lit up with the particular joy of a child who has just done something brave in front of a crowd. He clapped until his palms ached, and when she found him afterward and threw her arms around his waist, she pressed something small and hard into his hand, the same ceramic piggy bank, patched now with a careful line of glue where he'd once nearly dropped it in his hurry to hug her back. "I don't need it anymore," she told him simply. "You fixed it. You always fix it." He didn't correct her, didn't explain that some things had needed fixing on a scale far bigger than either of them, that a company's culture and a stranger's humility weren't things a father could simply repair with willpower alone. He just held his daughter's small hand in the crowded, noisy auditorium and let himself believe, for one unguarded moment, that she was right. Eleanor Voss, for her part, never forgot the sight of that little girl asleep in a car at 4 a.m, dragged into a crisis that was never hers to carry. She kept her promise about reforming how the company treated its people, but she also did something smaller, something no policy memo required. She showed up, unannounced, to the company's first Family Day event that spring, and she found Daniel and Lily by the sandwich table, and she crouched down to Lily's eye level and thanked her, quite seriously, for sharing her father with the company on the worst night of its history. Lily, who did not yet fully understand what her father had done, or why it mattered so much to the tall woman with the sharp eyes, simply shrugged and said that her daddy always helped people, that it was just what he did. Eleanor looked up at Daniel over the girl's head, and something passed between them that didn't need any more words. An understanding, hard-won and quietly permanent, that the people who build the world rarely stand where anyone can see them, and that the smartest thing a leader can ever learn is to look for them anyway, long before disaster forces her